Romans 4 through 8. Wow, man, it's power packed. These chapters are so rich and just have so much to them. onebaptist.org/devotional. Please go there, get the overview, and then get to the reading. I'm going to try in this 1 minute time frame here to give you just a little snippet from each chapter. In chapter 4, one of my favorite things about reading there is reminded of how we are justified. Justified, just as if I'd never sinned. If you, friend, are born again, Christ, God, does not look back at your past sins and remember them anymore. Can't we rejoice about that? Justified is what you are if you are born again. And yet, the fact of our past sins is why some people will never receive Jesus. They'll think that they've got too much baggage back there for God to save them right here. If that's you and you say, man, you just don't know what I've done, you just don't know where I've came from, what's back there that would have to be overcome, listen, Jesus has overcome it all. And Romans chapter 5 says that when you were in your most ungodly state, that Christ still died for the ungodly. It says that in chapter 5 in verse 6. It says in verse 8, but God commendeth his love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Listen, he knew who he was dying for. He knew who he was giving his life for so that they could have life. In fact, the very fact that we couldn't measure up is why he had to come and die. So he understood you would be ungodly. He understood I would be ungodly. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. For none are righteous, no, not one. And I'm very thankful that Jesus made a way. And so don't not receive him now because of this back here. Listen, he came so that he would overcome that back there, and we, trusting in him, would be made righteous in Jesus Christ. And yet, chapter 6 then tells us that if we are in Christ, then we can reckon ourselves as dead. Just count yourself as dead, and you do not have to sin in your body. And certainly, I would encourage us to read the Devo and read the Bible reading for you to get all that's there in that rich chapter of Romans chapter 6. And yet, Romans 7 talks about how there will be a war for you to sin. And Paul even talked about that. Have you ever been here where Paul is saying verses like in verse 15 where he says, for that which I do I allow not, for what I would that do I not, but what I hate that do I. You ever been there where the thing you don't want to do you are doing, and the thing you want to do you're not doing? Listen, there is that look, pinch yourself. Your soul is saved, but your flesh is not. This flesh will always desire a sin. It will desire that goes against God. Flesh never could please God, and flesh never can please God. Paul acknowledges that. He says in verse 18, for I know that in me, and he puts in parentheses, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. The reason, look, this flesh, there's no good to this flesh. He says, I know that, but I love how he says, I know that in me, that is in my flesh, because what is good is the Spirit of God that's in you, which of course Romans chapter 8 tells us that if you're saved, if you're born again, then the Spirit of God lives inside of you. In fact, if you don't have His Spirit, then you're none of His. But the fact that we are, then we have the Spirit inside of us. And to borrow a phrase from Galatians chapter 5, one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible, Galatians 5 and verse 16 says that if we walk in the Spirit, we shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. So Paul's battle of what he describes there in chapter 7 is that we can't depend upon the flesh to overcome the flesh. We have to allow the Spirit of God to do that. And Romans chapter 8 and verse 1 says, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus. But notice it doesn't have a period there. It has a comma, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Friend, saved person, if you are born again, don't lean on this flesh to not sin. Chapter 6 says you don't have to, but chapter 7 lets us know it'll be by the Spirit that you won't. And chapter 8 does tell us, hey, there's no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after, or who walk after the Spirit, but walk after the flesh, and you're going to sin, and there's still going to be consequences that come upon you. May we learn from Romans chapter 4 through 8 today and rejoice in the power of the Spirit of God.